The rain had been falling since Tuesday. Not the honest kind of rain that cleans a city, the kind that just reminds it of everything it cannot wash away. I had been nursing the same cup of cold coffee for 2 hours when she walked through my door without knocking, which is how trouble always arrives. It never waits to be invited. It never wipes its feet on the mat. My name is Jack Orton. I have been a private detective in this city for 11 years. And in that time I have seen women in distress wearing many things, tears, bruises, borrowed dignity. But I had never seen a woman wearing someone else's blood quite the way she wore it that night. Like a confession she hadn't yet decided whether to make. The red silk blouse beneath her coat told me enough for now. She was maybe 32, maybe older if her life had been unkind, which most lives are. Her hair was dark and rain-soaked, and she had pressed it away from her face with a hand that still trembled slightly, though she was working hard to make it stop. I noted the trembling, filed it away. In my line of work, the body always tells the truth a full minute before the mouth decides to catch up. I told her to sit. She sat on the edge of the chair nearest the door, which told me she was either preparing to run or still convincing herself she had made the right choice in coming here. I poured a second cup of coffee, the better cup, and slid it across the desk without a word. There are silences that ask questions louder than speech. I have learned to use them like a tool of the trade. She wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at me across the cluttered geography of my desk, the stacked case files, the ashtray full of philosophical remains, the photograph of a city I used to love before I learned what it kept in its pockets. Then she said she needed protection, not the police, not a lawyer, me, specifically me. She had been given my name by someone she refused to name. I asked about the blood. She looked down at her blouse as though she had briefly forgotten it was there, which I doubted. A woman does not forget that she is wearing another person's mortality pressed against her skin. She said it was not hers. I said I could see that. She said the man it belonged to was not coming back to reclaim it. There was no grief in her voice when she said it. There was something else, something I couldn't name yet. I lit a cigarette and waited. Outside, the rain threw itself against the window with the dedication of a debt collector. The single bulb overhead had been flickering since the war, and in its uncertain light she looked like something from a dream a man might have on the wrong side of a whiskey bottle. Beautiful in the way that dangerous things sometimes are, all clean lines and concealed edges. Her name, she said, was Vera Marsh. She told me she had witnessed something 3 hours prior in a building on the east side of Carver Street, in the private offices of a man whose name carried more weight in this city than most buildings. She had been there by invitation, she said, on a matter she described as personal. What she had seen there had turned the evening into something she could not walk away from unchanged. The blood on her blouse was the punctuation mark on that sentence. Then she said the name I had been half expecting and half dreading since she first opened her mouth, Judge Aldous Crane. The man who had sent 2 of my former clients to prison on evidence I had always suspected was arranged rather than discovered. The man whose photograph appeared in the society pages beside men who owned things, governors, captains of industry, bishops of churches that smelled of money even on an ordinary Tuesday morning. She said she had seen enough to bring him down, enough to unravel the careful myth of the man and leave the truth exposed like a nerve beneath a pulled tooth. She said men were already looking for her, that she had perhaps 90 minutes of obscurity left before her location was no longer a secret. I looked at her hands again. The trembling had stopped. That should have reassured me. It didn't. It troubled me far more than the trembling had. I stubbed out my cigarette and asked her what, precisely, she had witnessed. She chose her words the way a careful woman chooses a path across thin ice, each one placed with deliberate weight, testing the surface before committing. She said she had seen Judge Crane in the company of a man named Doyle. A man, she explained, whose occupation had never appeared in any public record. though his reputation had filtered through certain circles like smoke under a closed door. Doyle. I knew the name the way you know a bad tooth, not because you think about it constantly, but because it makes itself known at the worst possible moments. He was an intermediary, a fixer, the human equivalent of the fine print in a contract written specifically to be misunderstood. He moved money and favors and silence between men who could not afford to be seen exchanging such things in the open light of day. Vera said the meeting between Crane and Doyle had turned. That was the word she used, turned, and I appreciated its economy. At some point in that office on Carver Street, the arrangement between the two men had curdled into something irreversible. She had watched from a position she declined to specify. She had seen Doyle fall. She had heard the sound a man makes when the argument ends permanently. Then she had run. I asked her why she had been in that building in the first place. She said she had information Doyle wanted, and that he had promised her safe passage out of a situation she described only as complicated. I noted that she offered no further detail on the nature of that situation, and I noted that I did not press her on it. Every story has a room it keeps locked. I had learned to find the key before asking to be shown inside. The blood on her blouse, she said, came from her proximity to Doyle in the final moments. She had been close enough to catch what the violence produced, close enough to be a witness. Close enough, I thought, to be something other than a witness, but I kept that thought behind my teeth for the time being. It is a professional habit of mine to accumulate suspicions quietly before spending them all at once on the wrong conclusion. I asked her what she expected me to do. She said she needed a place to stay that was not her apartment, not a hotel where a name was required, and not anywhere that Crane's people, and she said it with the casual certainty of someone who knew. Such people existed, could find her before she had time to think clearly about her next move. Protection first, strategy second. It was a reasonable enough order of priorities, given the circumstances. I thought about saying no. I want to be honest about that. There are cases a man can smell from the first sentence. And they smell of burned bridges and broken crockery, and the particular silence that follows a gunshot in an enclosed room. This was that kind of case. Every reasonable instinct the first possessed was suggesting that I wish Vera Marsh a polite good evening and direct her towards someone younger, someone with fewer scars and more optimism about how these things end. But there was the matter of Aldous Crane, a judge who had, in my professional estimation, spent the better part of a decade converting the machinery of justice into a private instrument for the benefit of those who paid for his maintenance. If Vera Marsh had genuinely witnessed something that could dismantle that arrangement, then sending her back into the rain was not merely unkind. It was a kind of collaboration with everything I had spent 11 years resisting. I told her she could stay at a room I kept above a hardware store on Fenwick Lane, a place I used when a case required me to disappear quietly for a few days. The landlord was a retired merchant marine named Hasso, who asked no questions and remembered no faces, two qualities I valued in a man above nearly all others. I wrote the address on the back of a matchbook and slid it across the desk. She picked it up without looking at it and put it in her coat pocket. She stood to leave, and for the first time I had a full measure of her, the careful posture, the coat buttoned despite the indoor warmth, the way her eyes moved once more to the door and then back to me with a calculation in them that was not entirely consistent with the role of a frightened woman seeking refuge. I filed that away too. In this business, the things that don't fit the picture are usually the picture. I told her to go. She went. I gave her 10 minutes to clear the block, then pulled on my coat and hat and stepped out into the rain myself. A detective who simply waits for his client to report back is not a detective. He is a receptionist with a firearm. I needed to see Carver Street before someone else had the opportunity to rearrange it. Evidence is a perishable commodity in this city. It spoils fastest when powerful men are standing nearby with their hands in their pockets. Carver Street at that hour was the kind of empty that a city manufactures between midnight and 3 in the morning, not genuine emptiness, but a performed version of it, the street holding its breath and waiting to see what the darkness would produce. The building Vera had described was a 4-story limestone affair, the kind that had once housed a respectable firm and had since been converted into offices for men whose respectability was largely theoretical. The front entrance was locked, but the service door at the side had been left ajar with the kind of carelessness that suggested either panic or design. I noted that distinction without resolving it. Inside, the stairwell smelled of old wood and recent cigarette smoke, and something else beneath those, something iron-sweet and unmistakable. To anyone who has spent time in rooms where violence has recently conducted its business and then departed, leaving the invoice behind. The office on the 3rd floor had a frosted glass panel in the door with no name on it, which is itself a kind of name in certain circles. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open with my elbow, a habit I had developed early in my career, when I still believed that preserving a crime scene mattered more than the speed with which the men responsible for it would subsequently make it disappear. Old habits are hard to justify and harder to abandon. There was no body, I want to state that plainly. The room contained a desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet with its top drawer hanging open and empty, a telephone that had been pulled from the wall with sufficient force to leave a scar in the plaster, and a dark stain on the floorboards near the window that was still slightly tacky at its edges, and that confirmed, beyond any reasonable interpretive charity, that something living had recently ceased to be so. No body. Someone had been efficient. Someone had arrived between Vera's departure and my own, and had removed the central exhibit from the scene with the practiced calm of people who do this not as a crisis measure, but as a standard operating procedure. That kind of efficiency does not belong to amateurs. It belongs to organizations, the sort that maintain relationships with judges and have contingency plans filed under categories that do not appear in any public record. I crouched beside the stain and used my penlight to examine the perimeter of the room. Under the desk, I found a cufflink, silver, monogrammed with a letter D, which could have stood for Doyle, or could have stood for a dozen other names and proved nothing by itself. I pocketed it. I also found, caught beneath the leg of the filing cabinet, a torn corner of paper with 4 digits written in pencil, a partial number, a partial something. I pocketed that as well. I stood at the window and looked down at Carver Street. A black automobile was parked half a block south, its engine off but its exhaust still producing the faint ghost of warmth into the cold air, meaning it had arrived recently and been shut down deliberately. One man behind the wheel, not moving, not looking up, watching the building, or watching for someone leaving the building. The distinction mattered, and I did not yet have sufficient information to make it. I left the way I had entered, which is to say quietly and without announcement. On the street, I turned north and walked at the pace of a man with no particular destination, a useful fiction. In a city where purposeful movement attracts attention and aimlessness renders a person invisible. I did not look back at the black automobile. Looking back is for people who are not sure whether they are being followed. I was sure. The only question was by whom, and why, and in what order those 2 answers would become useful. By the time I reached my office again, the rain had softened to a mist, which in this city passes for mercy. I sat behind my desk and laid out what I had: a woman covered in blood that was not hers, a dead man whose body had already been collected like an overdue library book, a monogrammed cufflink, 4 penciled digits, and a black car idling south of a room that no longer contained its crime. It was, by any measure, a poor foundation. In this city, foundations like that are usually enough to bury a man. A man can sit with a partial number and a silver cufflink for only so long before the room starts to feel like a cage. I stood up, checked the cylinder of my revolver, and put on my hat. The rain had stopped outside, which meant the city was done pretending to cleanse itself. What remained was the truth of wet pavement and the particular smell of defeat that rises from storm drains after a long night. I walked to Fenwick Lane instead of taking a cab. Cabs leave records. Drivers remember faces when a man with the right amount of money asks the right questions. My shoes carried me through streets that had not seen sunlight in days. Past doorways where men slept in the shape of question marks. Past windows behind which other men were making decisions they would regret before breakfast. I thought about Vera Marsh. The hardware store on Fenwick Lane was closed, its windows dark behind iron grates. Hasso lived in the back and would not hear a key turning in the side door, even if he had been paid to listen, which he had not been. I climbed the stairs to the room above. The lock had not been tampered with. I knocked twice, the way I had told her to expect. No answer. I knocked again, harder. Still nothing. I opened the door with my own key and stepped inside. The room was empty. Not the kind of empty that means a person stepped out for a cigarette. The kind of empty that means a person never arrived. The bed was unmade from the last time I had used it. The single chair by the window held nothing but dust. The air had the stale quality of a place that had not been breathed in for weeks. She had not come here. I stood in the center of that small room and felt something settle in my chest that was not quite disappointment and not quite relief. A client who does not go where she is told is either a client who has found better shelter or a client who never intended to need shelter in the first place. Both possibilities carried their own weight. I sat on the edge of the bed and lit a cigarette. The match flared and died. The 4 digits written on that torn corner of paper. I took it out and looked at them in the dim light from the window. 7429. Not a telephone number. Too short. Not an address. No street name. A code, perhaps. A safe combination. Or the last thing a dying man wrote before his hand stopped moving. I had no way to know which, and in this business, a piece of evidence that could be anything is usually nothing at all. I left Fenwick Lane and walked east toward the address Vera had given me for her apartment. She had written it on a corner of my desk blotter while telling me she did not expect to return there. I had not asked why. Now I wished I had asked everything. That is the shape of regret in this profession. Not the things you did, but the questions you saved for later, when later turns out to be a room with no doors. Her building was on Mercer, a street of brownstones that had once housed families with names in the newspapers and now housed people who were trying to forget they had ever had names at all. The front door was secured with a lock that any child with a hairpin could defeat, but I did not need to defeat it. Someone had already forced it. The wood around the frame was splintered inward, fresh enough that the exposed grain was still pale. I went up the stairs slowly, my hand on the revolver in my coat pocket. The hallway smelled of cabbage and old secrets. Her door was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a corridor where the light bulb had burned out and no one had bothered to replace it. I stood outside and listened. Nothing. Not the careful nothing of a room pretending to be empty. The real nothing. The kind that has no heartbeat behind it. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The apartment had been searched. Not the theatrical destruction of a police raid or the careless chaos of common thieves. This was professional work. Drawers pulled out and replaced. Cushions lifted and set down again. Every surface examined and returned to its original position, with the obsessive care of a man who did not want anyone to know he had been there. I knew that kind of work. I moved through the small rooms cataloging what was missing. A desk drawer that contained nothing but an ink stain and a paperclip. A closet where a suitcase had recently sat, leaving an impression in the carpet fibers. A bathroom cabinet with a single empty space where a prescription bottle had stood. Someone had taken things. Someone had also left something. On the kitchen table, propped against a salt shaker, a business card. My business card. I had not given Vera Marsh my business card. I had written the address on a matchbook and slid it across my desk. The card on her table was old, dog-eared at the corners, creased down the middle as though it had lived in a wallet for months. Someone had been carrying my name long before tonight. Someone had placed it here, deliberately, either to warn me or to frame me. In this city, those two intentions often wear the same coat. I picked up my own card and turned it over in my fingers, nothing written on the back. No explanation, just my name and the address of my office. Printed in that cheap typeface I had chosen 11 years ago because it looked serious enough to inspire confidence and forgettable enough to disappear from memory. The card told me nothing except that someone wanted me to know they had been here. That someone wanted me to know they knew my name. I put the card in my pocket beside the cufflink and the torn paper. 3 pieces of evidence that did not yet form a picture. I had once watched a man assemble a ship inside a bottle using nothing but patience and a pair of tweezers. This felt like the opposite of that, taking a ship that had already sailed and trying to guess its destination from the shape of its wake. Possible, but only if you already knew the currents. I left Vera's apartment the same way I had entered, which is to say quietly and with my hand still resting on the revolver. The hallway was still dark, the stairs still creaked in the same places, but something had changed. The air felt different, charged, the way a room feels just before a storm breaks. I paused on the second floor landing and listened. Footsteps below me. Someone was climbing the stairs with the deliberate weight of a man who was not trying to be silent. I pressed myself against the wall and waited. The footsteps came closer. 1 flight below, then 2. Then the man turned the corner, and I saw him in the dim light from a transom window, broad shoulders. A hat pulled low, his hands empty and visible at his sides. That was the part one noticed first. Empty hands. In my experience, a man who climbs stairs in a building where a door has been forced open usually carries something. This one did not. He stopped when he saw me. We stood there on the landing, separated by 6 feet of worn linoleum and the particular silence that exists between 2 men who are both deciding whether the other is a threat. Then he spoke. His voice was low, the kind of voice that had been used to give orders in places where disobedience carried a surcharge. He said, my name. Jack Orton. Not a question, an acknowledgement. He had been looking for me. I asked him who he was. He said his name was Mercer, and that he worked for a man I had never met, but whose opinion of me was apparently quite high. I told him I was flattered. He said flattery was not the word he would have chosen. He reached into his coat slowly, the way a man reaches for his wallet when he wants you to see his hands at all times. What came out was not a wallet, it was a photograph. He held it up. The photograph showed Vera Marsh standing beside a man whose face had been deliberately scratched out, not torn, but scratched, as though someone had taken a knife to the emulsion. She was smiling in the photograph. Not the smile I had seen in my office, which was the smile of a woman calculating her escape. This was a real smile. The kind that means someone is standing beside you that you trust. The man whose face was gone. I looked at Mercer. He said the woman I knew as Vera Marsh had another name. 3 other names, actually, depending on which city she was working in at the time. He said she had a talent for finding men with secrets and a gift for turning those secrets into money. He said the blood on her blouse was not evidence of a crime she had witnessed. It was evidence of a crime she had arranged. Then he asked me where she was. I told him I did not know. Mercer looked at me for a long moment. In that look I saw the professional assessment of one predator measuring another, not for a fight, but for the truth. He believed me. That was the strange part. He believed that I did not know where she was, and that belief troubled him more than my lying would have. Because if I did not have her, and he did not have her, then someone else did. Someone who had gotten to her first. Someone who had left my business card behind as a signature. He turned and walked back down the stairs without another word. I listened to his footsteps fade until they were swallowed by the street door closing. Then I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. My hands were steady, which was good. My mind was not. A woman who might be a victim. A woman who might be a predator. A dead man whose body had vanished. a judge who owned half the city, and now a man named Mercer, who worked for someone whose opinion of me was high enough to send a photograph as a greeting. I went back to my office because I had nowhere else to go. The rain had started again, the dishonest kind, the kind that reminded the city of everything it could not wash away. The single bulb was still flickering, the coffee was still cold. I sat down and looked at the cufflink, the torn paper, the business card. 3 things. Then I noticed something I had missed before. On the back of my own business card, written in pencil so faint it was nearly invisible, a word: basement. Basement. Not my basement. I did not have a basement. My office was on the 2nd floor of a building that had a basement, but I had never been down there. The landlord kept it locked. I had assumed it contained nothing more interesting than old pipes and the skeletons of forgotten heating systems. But someone had written that word on my card and left it in Vera's apartment. Someone wanted me to go down there. The question was whether that someone was Vera or the person who had taken her. I took my revolver out of my pocket and checked it again. 6 chambers, all full. That was not a guarantee of anything except that I would not die from an empty gun. There are many ways to die in this city, and most of them do not involve bullets. Some involve basements. Some involve trusting the wrong woman. Some involve finding out the truth 5 seconds after it becomes useful. I stood up and walked to the door that led to the stairs. The stairs that led down. The stairwell to the basement was darker than the one in Vera's building had been. Darker and colder, with that particular dampness that suggests water has been seeping through stone for longer than anyone has cared to stop it. I used my penlight to find the steps. The beam caught dust and spiderwebs and the occasional glint of something that might have been a coin or might have been a cockroach's shell. I did not stop to investigate either. The door at the bottom was not locked. That was the first surprise. The landlord had always told me it was locked because the city required it, because the fire inspector had red tags and forms in triplicate. But the door opened when I turned the knob, and it opened without a sound. Someone had oiled the hinges recently. Someone had been coming down here. Someone had wanted the door to open quietly. I stepped inside and swept the penlight across the room. The basement was larger than I had expected, not the cramped crawl space of old pipes and fuse boxes. This was a proper room, perhaps 40 feet across, with a concrete floor and walls of painted brick. In the center stood a table. On the table, a telephone. Not an ordinary telephone, one of those old candlestick models, brass, the kind you see in photographs of offices from before the war. It had no cord, no connection to any wall. It sat there like a prop in a play that had not yet found its audience. I walked around the table slowly, my penlight tracing the edges of the room. Against the far wall, a filing cabinet. 4 drawers, all locked. Beside it, a coat rack with a single coat hanging from it, a man's overcoat. Dark gray with a label from a tailor I recognized as the same one who had made Judge Crane's suits. I'd seen that label before in a photograph attached to a case file I had never been able to close. My chest tightened. The coat had something in the pocket. I pulled it out with 2 fingers, careful not to disturb any evidence that might matter later. A photograph. The same photograph Mercer had shown me on the stairs. Vera Marsh standing beside a man whose face had been scratched out. But this copy was different. On this copy, someone had drawn an arrow in red ink pointing from the scratched-out face to the edge of the photograph, where a single word was written: Doyle. So the man whose face had been removed was Doyle, the man who had fallen, the man whose blood had decorated Vera's blouse, the man whose cufflink I had in my pocket. And someone had put this photograph here, in this basement beneath my office, inside a coat tailored for Judge Crane. Someone wanted me to make that connection. Someone wanted me to believe that Vera had been standing beside Doyle, smiling, before whatever happened on Carver Street had turned that smile into something else. I heard a sound behind me, a soft sound, the kind of sound a shoe makes when it moves from concrete to carpet, changing its texture, giving away its position. I did not turn around immediately. Turning around is for men who are not sure what they will find. I was sure. I had been sure since I saw the coat on the rack. The basement had not been left empty for me to discover. It had been left occupied. I said her name without turning. Vera. She stepped out from behind a pillar near the back of the room. The red silk blouse was gone. In its place, a black dress that fit her like a second skin, the kind of dress a woman wears when she is done pretending to be afraid. Her hair was dry now. Her hands were steady. She looked at me across the basement with an expression I had seen before on the faces of gamblers who have just watched the last card fall and know they have won. She said she was sorry about the deception. I asked her what deception. She smiled, and that smile was nothing like the one in the photograph. That smile had been real. This one was manufactured, assembled from spare parts, designed to produce a specific effect. She said the blood on her blouse had been hers after all, just not in the way I had assumed. She had put it there. She had taken it from a medical supply house on the south side, where a man with a needle and a steady hand could fill a vial for $20. She said Doyle was not dead. She had never said he was dead, she pointed out. She had said he had fallen. She had said the argument had turned. I had supplied the rest myself, filling in the gaps with the assumptions of a man who had seen too many bodies and not enough living witnesses. Doyle was alive. He was, in fact, the man who had written basement on my business card. He was waiting upstairs in my office. He wanted to meet me, properly this time. I stood there in the basement with the pen light still burning in my hand and tried to reassemble everything I thought I knew. Vera Marsh was not a client. She was a messenger. The blood was a prop. The trembling was a performance. The story about witnessing a murder was a script designed to produce a specific response in a specific audience. Me. I had been played. The question was why. And the answer, I suspected, was waiting upstairs in my chair, wearing Doyle's name like a borrowed coat. I asked her what Doyle wanted. She said Doyle wanted to make a deal. He had information about Judge Crane that could not be delivered through ordinary channels. He had tried the police. The police belonged to Crane. He had tried the newspapers. The newspapers belonged to men who belonged to Crane. He had tried leaving town. Crane's people had found him within 48 hours and had made it clear that leaving was not an option. So now he was trying the one thing he had not tried, a private detective. A private detective who had spent 11 years building a reputation for being too stubborn to buy and too poor to blackmail. A private detective whose file had been reviewed by men in better offices than mine. Men who had decided I was not worth the trouble of eliminating. I was, in other words, the only person in this city whom Judge Crane had not bothered to own. That was not a compliment. That was an indictment of everyone else. But it was also an opportunity. Doyle understood opportunity. I told Vera to go upstairs and tell Doyle I would be there in 5 minutes. She hesitated just for a second, and in that hesitation I saw something that had not been part of the performance. Genuine uncertainty. She did not know whether I would come up the stairs or go out the basement door and disappear into the rain. I let her wonder. Then I told her I had not spent 11 years being useless to men like Crane just to start being useful to them now. She left. I counted to 60. Then I followed. The stairs back up to my office felt longer than the stairs down. That is the nature of certain kinds of knowledge. Once you have it, the ground beneath you shifts, and every familiar landmark becomes suspect. My office's door was open. Light spilled out into the hallway, the flickering light of that single bulb I had cursed 1,000 times. I stepped inside and saw him sitting in my chair, behind my desk, with his feet on my blotter. Doyle, very much alive. He was smaller than I had imagined. In my line of work, a man's reputation often outgrows his physical container. Doyle was perhaps 50, with thinning hair and the kind of face that had been handsome once, before the weight of other people's secrets had pressed it into something softer and more sad. He wore a gray suit that had cost more than my rent and a pair of shoes that had never walked a block this far east. He removed his feet from my desk when I entered. Good manners, or the performance of them. He apologized for the theater. The blood, the trembling, the story about the body. He said Vera was the best he had ever worked with, and he had worked with many. She could produce tears on command, terror on a schedule, and the particular quality of vulnerability that made men like me want to protect her. I told him that men like me did not like being manipulated. He said he understood. Then he said something I did not expect. He said he was afraid, genuinely afraid, not for show. Doyle had been Judge Crane's intermediary for 7 years. He had moved money, silenced witnesses, arranged for evidence to disappear and reappear in the right places at the right times. He had built a career on being useful to a man who did not tolerate uselessness. But recently, he said, Crane had started cutting ties, not dramatically, not with violence, with silence, fewer phone calls, fewer meetings. The slow erosion of a relationship that had once been profitable for both parties. He said he had something Crane wanted back, something Crane had given him years ago for safekeeping, before the relationship had curdled. A ledger, the kind of ledger that does not record figures in dollars, but in favors, who owed whom, what had been promised, what had been delivered, what had been buried. The kind of ledger that could turn a judge into a defendant, and a fixer into a corpse. Crane wanted it. Doyle wanted to trade it for his life. That was where I came in. I asked him why he needed me. He said the ledger was not in his possession. It was in a place he could not reach without being seen. A place where Crane's people were watching every entrance and every exit. He needed someone who did not work for Crane. Someone whose face was not on the list of people to shoot on sight. He needed someone who could walk into that place, retrieve the ledger, and walk out again without anyone asking the wrong questions. He needed a private detective. I asked him where. He said the ledger was in the basement of the Carver Street building, the same building where he and Vera had staged the performance for my benefit. Beneath the office with the frosted glass door, behind a false wall that led to a room that did not appear on any floor plan. Crane had used that room for meetings he did not want recorded by any eye or ear. Doyle had hidden the ledger there 2 weeks ago, before he had fully understood that Crane intended to kill him. I asked him why he did not simply give Crane what he wanted and walk away. He laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. He said Crane did not negotiate with people who had seen what he had seen. The ledger was not a bargaining chip. It was a confession. Once Crane had it back, Doyle would be dead within the hour. The only way to stay alive was to make sure Crane never got it back, to make sure everyone got it. The newspapers, the prosecutors who were not on Crane's payroll, the public. I looked at Vera, who had positioned herself near the window, her back to the rain. She was watching me the way a chess player watches the board after making a move that seems reckless but might be brilliant. I have been in this city long enough to know that the truth is rarely a straight line. It doubles back. It hides in basements and behind false walls. It wears other people's blood and calls itself a confession. I lit a cigarette and asked Doyle what he was offering. He said he was offering me the one thing I had spent 11 years trying to find. The key to Judge Crane's kingdom. The evidence that would turn a lifetime of suspicion into a conviction. He was offering me the chance to do what no policeman, no reporter, no rival politician had been able to do. He was offering me justice, served cold and garnished with the names of everyone who had helped Crane poison this city. He was offering me my reputation, polished until it shone like a new badge. I took a long drag on my cigarette and let the smoke curl toward the ceiling. Offers like that come with a price, and it is never written on the front of the card. I asked him what he wanted from me in return, besides retrieving the ledger. He said he wanted safe passage out of the city. He wanted a new name, new documents, a destination that Crane's people would not think to check. He wanted to disappear, and he wanted me to make that disappearance possible. That was the deal. I told Doyle I did not arrange disappearances. I was a detective, not a travel agent. He smiled at that, a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. He said I had arranged disappearances before, for witnesses, for clients. For a woman named Ellen Cross, whose testimony had sent a man to prison, and whose address had been scrubbed from every record in this city. He knew about Ellen Cross. He knew about a lot of things. That was his job. Knowing things. The name Ellen Cross landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. I had not heard it spoken aloud in 5 years. She had been my client, my responsibility, my failure in a way I still did not like to examine too closely. I had helped her disappear after she had testified against a man Crane wanted protected. I had given her a new name, a new city, a new life, and I had never told anyone where she had gone. Doyle knew. Or he wanted me to think he knew. I asked him what he wanted with Ellen Cross. He said nothing. He was simply demonstrating that he had done his homework, that he understood what I was capable of, that he was not asking me to do anything I had not done before. He was asking me to do it again, for him. A ledger, in exchange for a life. It was a fair trade, he said. Fairer than most I would ever be offered in this city. I stubbed out my cigarette and looked at Vera. She nodded once. A small movement. I told Doyle I would retrieve the ledger on one condition. He asked what condition. I said I wanted to see it first. Not the whole thing. Just one page. One entry that I could verify independently. If the ledger was real, if it contained what he claimed it contained, I would help him disappear. If it was another performance, another basement full of props and photographs, I would walk out that door and let Crane's people find him wherever he was hiding. He agreed. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. Not the ledger itself, he said, but a photocopy of a single page. He had made it before hiding the original as insurance against the possibility that I would not believe him. I unfolded the paper and read the names written there. Names I recognized. Names that belonged to men who sat on benches, who wore robes, who signed warrants and pronounced sentences. Names that belonged to policemen, to prosecutors, to the mayor's own chief of staff. Beside each name, a number. Not a dollar amount, a case number. The kind of case number that appears on court documents, on docket sheets, on the official record of who was charged with what and who decided the outcome. I recognized several of those case numbers. They belonged to men I had investigated, men who had walked free despite evidence that should have put them away for decades. Men whose trials had been assigned to Judge Aldous Crane. The pattern was unmistakable. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket beside the cufflink, the torn corner, the business card. My pocket was becoming a museum of half-truths. I asked Doyle how he wanted to do this. He said the Carver Street building had a rear entrance on an alley, one that Crane's people might not be watching as closely as the front. He would draw their attention by approaching from the east. I would enter from the west, go down to the basement, retrieve the ledger from behind the false wall, and meet him at a location he would provide afterward. I asked him why he trusted me. He said he did not trust me. He trusted my self-interest. I had spent 11 years trying to build a case against Crane. Now I had the keys to that case in my hand. If I walked away, I would spend the rest of my career knowing I had let the moment pass. That kind of knowledge destroys a man, he said. Not all at once, slowly, the way water wears down stone. He had seen it happen. He did not think it would happen to me. Vera stepped away from the window and walked toward me. Up close she smelled of rain and something floral. Jasmine, perhaps, or the memory of it. She said she would come with me to Carver Street. Not because Doyle had asked her to, but because she wanted to see what I would do when I found the ledger. She said she had been watching men make choices for 7 years, and she had developed a talent for predicting which choices would lead to survival. She wanted to test her talent on me. I told her she could come, but she would stay outside. I worked alone. She smiled at that, the manufactured smile I had seen in the basement. She said every man who worked alone had a woman standing in the rain somewhere, waiting to clean up his mistakes. I did not have an answer for that. I pulled on my coat and hat and checked my revolver one more time. Doyle stood up from my desk and shook my hand. His grip was damp. Nerves or something like them. I walked out the door. The rain had found a new rhythm by the time we reached Carver Street. Harder now, the kind that stings the face and makes a man question his choice of profession. Vera walked beside me with her collar turned up and her hands in her pockets. She did not look like a woman who had performed terror in my office a few hours ago. She looked like a woman who had done this before, many times, and had learned to treat each new performance as simply another night's work. We approached the building from the west as Doyle had instructed. The alley behind Carver Street was narrow, barely wide enough for a single automobile, and it smelled of garbage and old regret. The rear entrance was a steel door painted the color of neglect. I tried the handle, locked, but the lock was old, the kind that surrenders to a man with a pick and a little patience. I had both. It took me 90 seconds. Vera watched without comment. Inside, the building was darker than it had been the first time. The power had been cut to the lower floors, or someone had deliberately thrown a switch to make the basement harder to find. I used my penlight again, keeping the beam low, keeping our shadows behind us. The stairs to the basement were at the end of a corridor lined with doors that had been painted shut years ago. I counted the steps, 23. Then the floor leveled out and I was underground. The basement of the Carver Street building was different from the one beneath my office. Larger, colder. The ceiling was crisscrossed with pipes that carried steam and water, and things I did not want to think about. The air smelled of rust and coal dust and the particular sweetness of decay that comes from standing water. I swept the penlight across the walls looking for the false wall Doyle had described. It took me a moment to find it. A seam, barely visible, where the brick had been cut and reassembled. The false wall was behind a stack of wooden crates labeled with the names of companies that had gone bankrupt before the war. I moved the crates one by one, trying to be quiet, trying not to think about what might be waiting on the other side of that wall. The seam revealed a narrow opening just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. I turned to Vera. She had stayed at the bottom of the stairs, her back against the wall, her eyes scanning the darkness behind us. She nodded. I went in. The room beyond the false wall was small, perhaps 10 feet square, and it contained exactly 3 things: a wooden chair, a metal safe bolted to the floor, and a man. The man was sitting in the chair with his hands in his lap and his head tilted back as though he had fallen asleep. But his eyes were open, and the front of his shirt was dark with something that was not coffee. I recognized him even before I brought the penlight to his face. Mercer, the man from the stairs, the man who had shown me the photograph. I did not need to check his pulse. The angle of his neck told me everything. Someone had broken it. Quickly, efficiently, without the mess of a gunshot or the noise of a struggle. Professional work. The same kind of professional work that had removed Doyle's body from the office upstairs, except now the body was here, in the room where the ledger was supposed to be. I crouched beside Mercer and looked at his hands. They were clean, no defensive wounds. He had not seen it coming. The safe was closed. I tried the handle. Locked. 4 digits. I took the torn corner of paper from my pocket and looked at the number written there. 7429. I had been carrying the combination since the beginning, and I had not known it. I spun the dial, feeling the tumblers click into place. The last number brought a heavy thunk from somewhere inside the mechanism. I pulled the handle. The safe opened. Inside, a leather-bound book. The ledger. I took it out and opened it to a random page. The handwriting was small and precise. The kind of handwriting that belongs to a man who does not want to be misunderstood. Dates, names, case numbers, dollar amounts that would have made a banker weep. And beside each entry, a notation in a different hand, Crane's hand. I suspected, though I had never seen his writing before. The notations were brief. Handled, resolved, transferred to favorable venue. The language of a man who had spent years learning how to say terrible things in the most ordinary way possible. I heard a sound from outside the false wall, a footstep, then another. Not Vera's footsteps, hers were lighter, quicker. These were deliberate, measured, the footsteps of a man who knew exactly where he was going and did not care who heard him coming. I closed the ledger, slipped it inside my coat, and pressed myself against the wall beside the opening. My hand found the revolver. I waited. The footsteps stopped just outside. Then a voice. A voice I did not know, but one that carried authority like a weapon. The voice said my name, not a question, an announcement, the same way Mercer had said it on the stairs, but with something different underneath, amusement, perhaps, or the particular satisfaction of a man who has arranged every piece on the board and is watching them fall into place. I did not answer. The voice said I could come out with the ledger, or I could stay in that room with Mercer's body and wait for someone to find me. Either way, the ledger was not leaving the building. I recognized the voice before I saw the face that went with it. It belonged to a man named Fallon, who had been Crane's personal secretary for 12 years, and whose official duties included nothing that would explain why he was standing in a basement with a dead man in a hidden room. Fallon was the kind of man who made his presence known through absence, the one who scheduled the meetings, who knew which doors to open and which to keep closed forever. He was here. That meant Crane was close behind. I stepped through the opening in the false wall, the ledger inside my coat, the revolver in my hand but pointed at the floor. Fallon stood alone in the larger basement, his hands at his sides, his overcoat buttoned against a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. He was tall, thin, with the kind of face that had been designed to be forgettable. I had seen his photograph a dozen times, and I still could not have picked him out of a lineup. That was his gift. He looked at the revolver in my hand and smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a threatening one. The smile of a man who had been threatened by better men than me and had outlived every one of them. He said I had something that belonged to his employer. I said I had something that belonged to the public. He said the public did not know what to do with the truth, why men like Crane existed, to manage the truth, to dispense it in measured doses, to protect people from themselves. I asked him where Vera was. He tilted his head slightly, as though I had asked a question whose answer should have been obvious. He said Vera had been collected. That was the word he used, collected, as though she were a package left on a doorstep. She had been collected by men who worked for Crane, men who had been watching the building from the moment Doyle had made the mistake of telling anyone about the ledger. They had her. They had Doyle too, probably. And now they had me. I told him I was not collected yet. He nodded, conceding the point. He said I had a choice. I could hand over the ledger and walk out of the basement with my bones intact. Or I could keep the ledger and discover what happened to men who tried to hold something that belonged to Judge Aldous Crane. He said the choice was mine, but I had 30 seconds to make it. He looked at his watch. A gold watch. The kind that gets passed down through generations of men who never worked for a living. 20 seconds, he said. I looked around the basement. No other exits except the way I had come in. No windows. No second door. Just Fallon standing between me and the stairs, his hands still at his sides, his smile still in place. 15 seconds. I thought about the ledger inside my coat, the names, the case numbers, the notations in Crane's own hand. Evidence that could finally bring him down. And I thought about what that evidence was worth if I was dead. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. 10 seconds. I made a decision. Not the decision a hero would have made. Not the decision I would have made when I was younger and still believed that justice was something you could hold in your hand, like a winning lottery ticket. I reached inside my coat and pulled out the ledger. Fallon's smile widened. I tossed it to him. He caught it with one hand, the way a man catches a ball he has been expecting for a very long time. He opened it, glanced at a page, and nodded, satisfied. He said I had made the right choice. I said I had made the only choice. He said that was the same thing in the end. Then he turned and walked toward the stairs, the ledger tucked under his arm like a newspaper. He did not look back. He did not need to. He knew I was not going to shoot him in the back. That was not my kind of work. My kind of work was sitting in an office, drinking cold coffee, waiting for clients who never came. I watched him disappear up the stairs. I stood alone in the basement with Mercer's body behind the false wall, and the smell of rust in my nostrils, and the sound of my own breathing. I had given up the only evidence that could have destroyed Crane. I had done it because I was outnumbered and outmaneuvered, and because I wanted to live long enough to be angry about it later. That is not an excuse. That is a confession. I put the revolver back in my pocket and walked up the stairs. The rain had stopped. The city was waiting. I walked back to my office through streets that had been washed clean by the rain, though nothing underneath had changed. The city was still the same collection of compromises and small betrayals. I was still the same man who had spent 11 years chasing a ghost named Justice. The only difference was that now I knew where the ghost lived, in a leather-bound book that was already on its way back to Judge Crane's hands, along with any hope I had of ever using it. My office was empty when I returned. No Doyle, no Vieira, no sign that either of them had ever been there except the cold coffee in my cup, and the indentation on the edge of my desk where Doyle had rested his feet. I sat down and lit a cigarette. The single bulb flickered above me, and I thought about the things a man loses in this profession. Not just cases, not just clients. The ability to trust the difference between a victim and a performance. That goes first. The telephone rang at 20 minutes past 4 in the morning. I let it ring 3 times before I picked it up. A voice I did not recognize told me that Vera Marsh had been found in an alley behind a hotel on the south side. The voice said she had fallen from a window on the 6th floor. The voice said it was being ruled a suicide. I listened to the rest of the details without speaking. When the voice finished, I hung up and sat in the dark for a long time. Suicide, that was the word they used when they wanted a story to end without questions. I had seen enough falls to know that a woman like Vera did not jump. She was pushed, or she was dropped, or she was simply erased by men who had better things to do than clean up their own messes. The blood on her blouse had been a prop, but the blood in that alley would be real. That was the difference between performance and consequence. One you can walk away from, the other walks away from you. I never saw Doyle again. I heard through channels that did not wish to be named that he had been picked up by Crane's people and had been given a choice. The same choice I had been given, the ledger or his life. Unlike me, Doyle had nothing left to trade. The ledger was already back in Crane's possession. Doyle was a man without currency. I did not ask what happened to him. In this city, a man without currency is a man without a future. I did not need the details. The cufflink is still in my pocket. The torn corner of paper with the 4 digits is still in my wallet. The business card with basement written on the back is still on my desk. I keep them as reminders of something I cannot quite name, not regret, not hope, just the shape of a moment when I thought I could change things. That is the cruelest trick this city plays on a man. It lets him believe, just long enough, that the evidence in his hand might actually matter. Judge Aldous Crane is still on the bench. He still wears suits from that tailor. He still appears in photographs beside governors and bishops and men who own things. The ledger is back in whatever basement he chooses to keep it. The machinery of justice continues to operate according to his specifications. And I am still sitting in this office, drinking cold coffee, waiting for the next woman to walk through my door without knocking. The difference is that now I know what to look for. The trembling, the blood that is not hers. The story that fits together too neatly. A detective who cannot tell the difference between a client and a conspirator is not a detective. He is a prop in someone else's performance. I was a prop for Doyle and Vera. I was a prop for Fallon and Crane. I've been a prop in this city for 11 years, and the only thing I have learned is how to recognize the shape of the stage. That is not nothing, but it is not enough. It has never been enough. and I have stopped believing that it ever will be. The rain has started again, the dishonest kind. The kind that reminds the city of everything it cannot wash away. I pour myself another cup of coffee and watch the water run down the window glass. Somewhere out there, a woman named Vera Marsh is being filed away in a drawer marked suicide. Somewhere out there, a man named Doyle is learning what happens to fixers who outlive their usefulness. And somewhere out there, Judge Aldous Crane is sleeping in a bed that costs more than I will earn in my lifetime. My name is Jack Orton. I have been a private detective in this city for 11 years. In that time, I have learned that the truth does not set you free. It just gives you something new to carry. The ledger is gone, Vera is gone, Doyle is gone, but I'm still here, sitting behind this desk, waiting for the next knock on the door. That is not courage. That is not hope. That is simply the habit of a man who does not know how to do anything else. The rain falls. The city waits. So do I.